For nearly 2 centuries, societies have weighed the merits of free market capitalism and socialism. Debates continue over which system maximizes prosperity and better promotes human flourishing. Free market capitalism decentralizes economic decisions, giving individuals control over what to produce, how much to charge, and what to buy. Their decisions are informed by market prices, which convey important information about scarcity and consumer value. Proponents contend that capitalism delivers the best economic outcomes by giving individuals incentives to create and produce. Critics, on the other hand, point to the persistence of poverty in market economies and rising inequality as proof that capitalism fails to deliver broad-based prosperity. They maintain that this inequality ultimately gives the rich disproportionate economic and political power. In contrast, socialism grants the government the authority to make most economic decisions. The government chooses how to allocate scarce resources based upon what it determines to be most useful to society as a whole. Proponents argue that socialism ensures society's resources are fairly distributed. Critics claim that socialism fails to give people proper economic incentives to innovate and produce, which ultimately reduces economic opportunities for all. Opponents further argue that socialism's powerful central governments become autocratic and threaten political freedom. So which system is better for humanity? For as long as this question has been asked, the debate all too often devolves into name-calling and emotional arguments that fail to advance the discussion. And yet, it is imperative that we keep asking. The Human Prosperity Project at the Hoover Institution seeks to overcome these preconceptions. It employs analysis of free market capitalism and socialism and its many variants to assess how each system affects human flourishing.
Welcome to the Human Prosperity Project from Stanford University's Hoover Institution. I'm Russ Roberts, the John and Jean Nault Research Fellow here at Hoover and host of the weekly podcast Econ Talk. This speaker series is based on research and commentary from Hoover scholars participating in the Human Prosperity Project on socialism and free market capitalism. The goal of this project is to investigate the historical record to assess the consequences for human welfare, individual liberty, and interactions between nations of various economic systems. You can go to hoover.org, hoover.org, to find long-form essays, short videos, commentary, and this speaker series. During today's presentation, be sure to use the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen to submit questions to our panelists. I'm joined today by Hoover colleagues Terry Anderson and Steve Haber to discuss innovation, property rights, and the rule of law. Both have written papers for this project available at hoover.org. Terry Anderson is the John and Jean Nault Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, past president of the Property and Environmental Research Center in Bozeman, Montana, and a professor emeritus at Montana State University. He's one of the founders of free market environmentalism, the idea of using markets and property rights to solve environmental problems, and he's the chair of the Hoover Project on Renewing Indigenous Economies. Steve Haber is Peter and Helen Bing Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution and the A.A. and Jean Welch Milligan Professor in the School of Humanities and Sciences at Stanford University. He's a professor of political science, history, and economics, as well as a senior fellow of both the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research and the Stanford Center for International Development. He was former director of Hoover's Intellectual Property, Prosperity and Innovation Working Group known as IP Squared. Welcome, gentlemen. Now, Steve, you describe innovation as, quote, the creative act of seeing a demand curve that may not yet exist, imagining a product or service that will meet that demand, combining multiple technologies that already exist while inventing others that do not yet exist to build that product or service, recruiting people with the necessary skill sets, and persuading yet other people to risk their savings on the idea and the people. End of quote. You emphasize this innovation doesn't take place in a vacuum. There are important institutional arrangements that nurture it. What are those important institutional arrangements?
I think that the key to an innovative ecosystem is not any one particular policy or institution. It's a complex combination of institutions and policies and belief systems that gives rise to an environment in which people are able to believe that they will reap the returns to their efforts. It's characterized by decentralization, therefore, of political power, of lawmaking, and of the choices in front of people. That basically comes down to the ability to act freely and know that others will also be able to act freely. If you don't have those fundamentals, it is very hard to generate an innovative society and therefore an innovative economy. Some of the things that you then observe that come out of such a system is, for example, private property and the notion of private property. One of the other things that comes out of such a system is private contracting and bodies of law that make it easy to enforce contracts. But the key point I want to make here is that it's a set of practices, institutions, policies that give rise to a way of interacting amongst people. It's not any one particular policy that you can point to and say, oh, that's the key.
Well, one thing I think you implied but didn't explicitly describe would be the rule of law. You talked about it implicitly, and we had a recent session with George Schultz and John Taylor that viewers can go back and watch, where we talked about the rule of law. Why is that important? What does that mean? It really is about the predictability, isn't it, that you were emphasizing?
The key to the rule of law is that everyone, including the government itself and the public officials in the government, both elected and non-elected, also have to conform to the law. If, for example, so here's an example, just to make this sort of very clear. In order to get innovation, people need to be able to be assured that they're going to get a return from their innovation. So imagine a patent system. You could have a patent law. But now imagine that the government or somebody in the government could arbitrarily change the terms of your patent. Well, then your patent would be worthless. Or imagine that you get a use general corporation to get a charter for a joint stock company that's going to use the patents to create a commercial product. But now imagine somebody in the government can amend arbitrarily the charter for your company. So rule of law is key here, and the rule of law itself comes out of all of the political institutions and the beliefs that people have amongst those institutions, an independent judiciary, for example, but that's not the only one, that allows people to operate in an environment in which they're assured that they will be able to reap the returns to their efforts.
Turn to Terry. Terry, what is environmental entrepreneurship, and how does the innovation that Steve's talking about play a role in that entrepreneurship?
When we turn to environmental issues, especially since the 1970s, it has been environmental socialism. It is the notion that somehow the government, as the opening video shows, must decide how much air quality, how much water quality, how many birds we save, how much habitat we save, and so on. The idea of environmental entrepreneurship is to take just what Steve has been talking about and what his excellent description of innovation is, and use that innovation to achieve environmental ends, environmental goods and services. Steve says we need to discover demand. We need to know who the demanders are. We need to know what products will provide them. We need to use technology to meet these demands. We need to find suppliers and so on. And there's no better example of this than environmental entrepreneurship in the case of birds. There are 600,000 members of the Audubon Society. 100,000 of those people use an app called eBird. Now, this means there is a demand curve out there. The question is, how can we harness that? The Nature Conservancy has used the crowdsourcing app of eBird to find where the birds are and what the birds need. So in the Central Valley of California, there are huge flocks of sandhill cranes, of geese, of trumpeter swans even, that migrate through there. And if they don't have water, then they don't do well, they don't survive. The Nature Conservancy uses the crowdsourcing, the technology that Steve described, to meet the demand, these 100,000 people who are interested in birds, and they contract, back to the other point Steve is making, the importance of contract, they contract with farmers to flood their fields when the birds are there, and they pay the farmers to do that. They provide an incentive for the farmers to do so. And so it's a great example of an environmental entrepreneurship and a great example of innovation.
In his recent book, Matt Ridley, the book is How Innovation Works, he emphasizes the role of tinkering, trial and error, and also the fact that some of the people who make the most important innovations aren't the people who make the inventions, say the underlying science. It's actually mechanics, bicycle riders, blacksmiths, and others trying different things that come up with the actual product that's useful to another human being rather than just a technical result. Terry, do you have any examples of where tinkering or trial and error played an important role in environmental entrepreneurship and innovation in that area?
The tinkering that Matt talks about is, I think, extremely important. And if you go back to the example I gave of birds or wildlife generally, it often isn't some professor at a university who has studied exactly what birds need and where they are at certain times, but rather tinkering using, again, this crowdsourcing app of eBird, which was invented just so people could communicate with one another about where birds are. So it's really an example of tinkering. Or let me give another example that I think is a wonderful one. When wolves were brought back to Yellowstone in the late 1980s, the question was, well, what's going to happen when these wolves attack livestock? And an environmental entrepreneur here in Montana tinkered. He had talked to lots of ranchers, knew they were upset about the possibility of livestock being killed. And he got people by selling a poster to put up money into a trust fund that he then used to pay the ranchers for livestock lost. Every bit of that was I think, Matt Ridley's tinkering. The notion that you could have a trust fund, the notion you could sell a poster to get some money, and on and on. And the result was he single-handedly really, he worked then for Defenders of Wildlife, reduced much of the acrimony with wolf reintroduction. So I think the environmental movement is just filled with cases where environmental entrepreneurs are tinkering, and it's that tinkering that makes a difference. Environmental entrepreneurs are the ones who do that tinkering.
Steve, can you weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Terry's pointed to something which is really key, which is both of the examples that he gave are about individuals writing private contracts that are enforceable and that do not require centralized decision-making. It's about local people on the ground who understand the particular problem to be solved, coming up with a solution. That is, at its core, what innovation is about. And I'd contrast that with top-down sort of solutions, as Terry alluded to, in which, in some centralized way, we will regulate what happens rather than allow people to contract in order to solve a problem. It makes the United States extremely unusual, both around the world today and in world history, in terms of the use of private contracting to solve important problems. We tend to sort of favor market solutions rather than centralized political solutions.
Yeah. An amazing example of that, of course, is the fracking revolution that made the United States going from a contributor to energy to becoming the #1 producer of, I think, oil in the world right now, ahead of Saudi Arabia, ahead of Russia. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that in the United States, you own the ground under your property, whereas in other countries, it's owned publicly, and that opens up an enormous Pandora's box for innovating in that area. And of course, the fracking revolution is a perfect example of Matt Ridley's tinkering and trial and error, an enormous number of failures on the way to figuring out a way to totally transform the price of energy, the supply of energy, particularly natural gas, which of course is reduced the carbon footprint of the United States and that substitution of natural gas. Terry, let's move to environmental issues more explicitly. Steve writes about the power of innovation to spur growth, the importance of institutions to create that innovation that leads to the growth. You argue that growth in the well-being of the nation, the material well-being of the nation, is actually good for the environment. And I think most people would find that very perplexing. Most people would assume that if we're growing, we're obviously using up scarce resources, and yet that is not always and often is not the case. So please explain.
Well, I'll start by just re-emphasizing innovation. I don't think we can emphasize it enough. That growth, and Steve's essay illustrates this. Growth is much more related to innovation than it is to resource use. You only need to look around at places that are quite rich, that have very few resources. Hong Kong, Singapore, other small countries, Liechtenstein. They don't have resources, but they are innovative in every way. That isn't to say that resources aren't important. We in the United States have been endowed with an incredible land resource, with incredible energy, fossil fuel energy resources. So they have been a part of driving growth. But what I think is left out of the discussion when people argue that the environment suffers is the notion that if you aren't rich, you probably aren't an environmentalist. If you have a stomach that's growling and children who are malnourished, if you don't have a roof over your head, if you don't have good medical care, you aren't likely to buy into the kinds of slogans that dominate the environmental movement. I'd love to visit Africa. I've been there many times, and when I have, and you talk to people who live with, say, marauding elephants, why do you kill them? And the answer is because we're poor. We can get money from tusks, and we care more about filling our bellies and building those roofs. So I think that what happens then is, as people do begin to become richer, they also become environmentalists. And we in the United States, it's easy to be an environmentalist. We are a rich country. We can afford to put resources into saving species. And so there is this early part of development that may lead to some environmental degradation, the digging of a coal mine, a strip mine to provide the coal. But as we get richer, and you only need to look at strip mining as an example, we demand that there is reclamation of those lands, and we can afford to put our effort, our innovation into saving the environment. And we think nothing of setting aside vast tracts of land because we want to save habitat for say the birds I talked about earlier, or vast tracts of land that we want to leave off limits to certain kinds of development. We can afford to do that. We can afford that kind of environmental socialism because capitalism has made us wealthy enough to be able to demand and produce those kinds of environmental goods and services.
But what about climate change, which appears to be correlated with economic growth, at least for now? Is that a concern?
Well, the climate change issue is always the elephant in the room. It's always the one that comes back and is used to say just what you did, Russ, that economic growth has caused this problem. We've built our empires on burning fossil fuels. The burning of those fossil fuels leads to the carbon in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases, and soon we will find out what the results of that are as sea levels rise, hurricanes increase, and so on. But again, I think the important thing to understand with climate change is that it is not people in the United States who are really going to suffer from climate change. It'll be people in Bangladesh or poorer countries in Africa. And once more, it is prosperity that allows us to deal with climate change. We can gnash our teeth and spend hours and hours in congressional debates about, is there climate change or isn't there climate change? And most people today agree that there is climate change. Temperatures are rising, that it's at least partially caused by human beings. We can spend lots of time in rich countries talking about this. It's the poor people who won't be able to deal with it. And finally, it's the dealing with it that matters. If you look at the damage from hurricanes, we've got one going on right now, and we can see the news pictures. Sure, there's damage, but we have far less damage in the United States from a hurricane because we're rich enough to build strong buildings. We're rich enough to put up seawalls. We're rich enough to take all kinds of precautions to reduce the effect of hurricanes, or in general, the effect of climate change.
Steve, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think the climate change issue is a good one to sort of point up in stark relief what the trade-offs are in front of humanity. I mostly agree with Terry. The world that we have created with very high levels of material prosperity is an outcome of, in part, an outcome of fossil fuel technologies. There are hydrocarbons in just about everything. It's not just in the electricity in your home. It's not just the gasoline in your car. It's the fertilizers that grew the food. It's the hydrocarbons that are in the synthetic clothes, synthetic cloth that you may be wearing. And that it is the ability to move goods and food around the planet that allowed human beings to escape the Malthusian trap of every increase in local productivity getting dissipated because it ran up against the constraints of what you could grow locally, given a technology that was very, for storage and production, that was very rudimentary. Now, there are a lot of people, some including my students, they're very well-meaning. I take them at their word that are concerned about climate change, and I am too. But what they propose is that we go back to a world without fossil fuels. What needs to be understood is that there is a very large trade-off to doing that. because we will be unable to sustain the current world population without those technologies. That means that we would be put in a position of having less food for the planet, less energy for people to use, less lowered material standard of living. I think that one of the things that the environmental movement is going to need to come to grips with, and I include myself here as someone who's an environmentalist, is what trade-offs are people actually willing to make? My sense of observing how people actually behave, rather than what they say are their goals, is that they're not really willing to make a lot of trade-offs. And so the implication is that what's going to actually be necessary to do is to mitigate as best we can climate change, rather than go back to a world that was not a fossil fuel based world. That is going to be extremely difficult to do and to get the rest of the world to go along.
Now, Terry talks a lot about that in his paper on about adaptation. Terry, do you want to mention that?
Well, first just mention, as Steve's pointing out, that if we take some of the draconian measures that are suggested for weaning ourselves from fossil fuels, it will require far more land to produce the food for the planet, and that means less habitat. And I think that, again, those are the kind of trade-offs we have to face up to. The other point I think that's really important, and this goes right along with Steve's paper and comparisons with China, rich countries like the United States are reducing their carbon footprint, and they're doing it through innovation, far less than regulation. And yet you turn to places like China, former Soviet Union, now Russia, the increases in fossil fuel use per capita in those countries are adding to the carbon emissions now and to the stock of carbon in the atmosphere that's really the end result of which is global warming. I agree with Steve entirely that some efforts at mitigation are important. I mentioned building seawalls or building stronger buildings to withstand hurricanes, have air conditioning. Those are all parts of how we mitigate the effects of climate change. And we can do that because we're rich enough to do it in the United States. The part of the equation that's left out is adaptation. And the Hoover Institution is publishing a book later this year on adapt and be adept, the way markets respond to climate change. And the key here is to understand that asset values reflect how the climate is changing. And so there are estimates that there'll be far less grape production in places like California. Guess what? There may be grape and wine production in Montana, where I'm sitting right now. And that kind of change, that adaptation will come because the price of land in Montana is cheap compared to California. But if the weather changes, it'll be more productive for producing grapes and wine. So adaptation, another example is the price of real estate along coastlines is actually not rising as rapidly as real estate at higher elevations. In Miami-Dade County, for example, there's a 7% discount on a seashore property because of the kind of effects that come from climate change. So markets are taking this into account. They are getting people to adapt, and we are becoming more adept.
So you could argue, we have a question here in the audience from Bob. I'm going to paraphrase it a bit to make it fit in with what you just said, Terry. You could argue that markets can handle some of these things well. We're not going to need to, as long as climate change, if it does come and it's significant and sea level rises and happens slowly, people will migrate away from the coastline, steered by market signals, in a way similar to the way that your birds you talked about earlier are steered by, their water gets steered by the market signals of people using that birding app. And I think there are more dramatic levels of catastrophic change. People are worried about extinctions of in large amounts, or just clean air generally that have either benefited or would benefit from more widespread government intervention. So I want to give you a chance, both you gentlemen, to talk about the role of government in environmental issues, if you could. Steve, you can go first.
Yeah, so I think it's very important to keep in mind that there are actually two markets operating. One is a market in which the currency is dollars. And when people use the word market, that's the markets they tend to have in mind: labor markets, capital markets, markets for goods and services. And then they say, oh, well, there's this other thing over here called government. Well, actually, government is also a market, but the currency isn't dollars, it's votes. And so people are expressing their preferences about how to make the best world for themselves and their families and their communities through both of these markets. They're acting through product and capital and labor markets with dollars, and they're operating through what I call markets for regulation, markets for taxation, by voting. And one of the things I don't think we can underestimate here is that it's the impact of both markets operating side by side that get us to a social equilibrium in which human beings thrive. The idea that it's one or the other it has not been a success anywhere. So there are systems, for example, where we don't vote. China is a great example, but one of the things I want to point out here is China never had voting. Not since the end of the Warring States period has China ever had anything that resembled parliaments, voting, suffrage of any kind. This has always been a very, very centralized system. And that means that decisions have been made for over 2 millennia from the top down in China. Socialism is just a sort of a new incarnation of a politically centralized system. So when we use the word markets and we contrast it with, government, I want us to be clear that our government is also, in many respects, a market outcome. And that is also unusual in world history because we have multiple such political markets in the United States in which municipalities and states are really important parts of the general ecosystem of both political and economic markets. There are very few places on the planet, in fact, where where local governments have significant independent taxation and spending power. And very few places on the planet where states have the kind of independent taxation and spending power they do in the US. And so that's one of the keys to the way the market for everything in the United States works. The idea that there's we'll live without regulation, we'll live without taxation, I think that is a very simplified view of how markets actually work.
Terry?
Yeah, let me start by saying that democracy is an incredibly important driver in environmental quality as well. Several groups produce an index called the Environmental Sustainability Index, and I edited a book for Hoover in which Seth Norton examined the Environmental Sustainability Index in the context of countries that are freer, that have democracy as a driving force in how government is organized. And over, the results show that you get a better environment from democratic countries with all the things Steve has been talking about. So I think that's the first important point to make. The second point I want to emphasize is that the use of markets as opposed to governments is extremely important to understand in the context of climate change. I can remember sitting often at lunch with our late colleague Gary Becker arguing about, should we have a carbon tax? And economists love the idea of a carbon tax, and we love to draw the diagrams on the blackboard or whiteboard, or now in our Zoom PowerPoints, of just how much we could achieve if we used a carbon tax. And yet we don't have a carbon tax, and we aren't likely to get a carbon tax. And Ronald Coase, the great property rights economist, pointed out that we get trapped in what he called blackboard economics. And we economists think, oh, this is efficient, it'll be great. But as Steve is suggesting, all of this transpires in a world of politics. I was at a Wall Street Journal conference with the former CEO of General Electric. And Jeff Immelt was going on about how we needed to have carbon taxes, but his company ought not to be taxed. And when I asked a question about, well, what about the smaller companies? He said, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And his point was, we're in Washington, D.C. lobbying, and we're going to be sure that our company doesn't suffer from these regulations. But what it really does when that happens is that it stifles the innovation that this project and that Steve and I are talking about is so crucial to solving problems, even the global ones like climate change.
Let's jump in on that, because Terry's raised a really important point. And that is that there's a difference between businesses operate in both markets. They operate in the market for regulation, and they operate in the market for their product, labor markets, and capital markets. They're doing both. Big businesses, actually all businesses, try to operate in both markets, and big businesses tend to be very good at operating in both markets. There's a market for lobbying. It is one of the features of the US system is that the decentralized nature of the political markets allows for pushback against large firms who want to dominate political markets. This makes the US system very unusual by the standards of other countries. If you were to look, for example, in Germany, what you'd find is that a few very, very large firms have dominated the economy for more than a century. And it's because they have a comparative advantage in the market for regulation. So whatever regulations the population wants, however well-meaning they may seem, they can get distorted in the market for politics, and you can wind up in a centralized system with less innovation rather than more innovation. You can in fact wind up in such a system with an awful lot of coal burning in order to generate electricity, however well-meaning the initial goal was.
I think when economists talk about a carbon tax, they often say, and of course, at the same time that we put the carbon tax on, we would lower the income tax rate, so it would be what economists call revenue neutral. And that particular ideal might be appealing on the blackboard, as Terry or Ronald Coase would say. Doesn't seem to be a piece of legislation that does that. And I think most people suspect that if we had a carbon tax, it would be on top of our income tax. And so it's never gotten the traction that I think a lot of people would like it to have. Let's turn to yeah.
Let me just add very quickly that even if the traction were there, even if we did everything that's proposed in the Paris Accord for dealing with climate change, and every country adapted these optimal carbon taxes, what we find when we look at the effect of this on the carbon stock that's in the atmosphere, it's trivial. And in fact, by the year 2100, we will only, if we did all that, and it ain't going to happen, if we did, it would only reduce the global temperature by less than 1 degree Celsius. And no scientists who are worried about climate change think that's enough. It will take innovation, and that is what will ultimately help us deal with climate change.
So let me sort of run with this here, because this intersects very strongly with the sort of notion of an innovative economy. So one of the ways in which you could reduce our carbon footprint, and let me be very clear here, I think we should. I think that it would be nice to get to a world of more renewables. I am in favor of that, so that we're not, people don't, misconstrue what I'm about to say. How are we going to get there? Well, we have a technology for generating electricity in a decentralized manner. In fact, most of Terry will correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that most of the fossil fuels burned in the United States are for the purposes of generating electricity. Well, we have a decentralized way of doing it. It's called a solar panel. The problem is, of course, that it only works when the sun is out. So what's the constraint? Well, the constraint is battery technology to store the energy that gets generated on your solar panels during the day, so you have electricity at night. How are we going to solve the problem of battery technology? Well, I'm betting on innovation incentivized by markets to do it. And in fact, I know at a lot of universities, Stanford included, there are colleagues furiously working on this, and they're working on it both because they're encouraged by the public demand to do something positive, but also because they can get a patent for their invention and reap some of the returns to the risk that they bore and are bearing to do it. So I think that, it's going to be to think that we're going to solve one problem with innovation and another problem with government. I think that innovation is likely to be our best solution here. And one of the most important is going to be around the ability to store electricity, something we've never been particularly good at.
Well, we've got only a few minutes left. Let's close to talk about inequality. Both your papers sing the praises of growth. I'm a pretty big fan of growth myself, but usually we're talking as economists about what we might call growth on average. Often we're talking about, say, per capita, per person, and we tend not to pay as much attention until recently to how that economic well-being is shared. A lot of people are concerned about inequality these days, so I'd like you to weigh in on it. So it's true, Terry, that if we grow dramatically, we'll probably have a demand for a better environmental quality through government intervention, as well as our personal choices. But are you concerned at all about how that growth is shared?
Well, that one cannot be callous about that. It has driven a lot of the turmoil that we've experienced in the last year or so. So inequality is a key factor that I think is too often left out. And it's left out of the environmental discussions as well. And yet, if you look at environmental equality, if we want to call it that, and ask, where are the poor people, the people at the bottom of the income distribution, where do they stand with respect to environmental quality? And the answer is they're better off in countries that are all the things we've described, that are wealthy because they have a rule of law, they have democracy, they have property rights, contracting, and so on. And so if we can turn to the water quality problem in Detroit, which was largely driven by inept government. And what we find is that any place you look in the United States, drinking water is not the problem that it is in the poor countries of Africa, say, or the poor countries of South America. Clean air, we have clean air. Of course, right now we don't because of fires, but people don't worry about the kinds of air quality issues that would reduce age, reduce the average age of death, because we have clean air. We are not burning dung in our kitchens without a stovepipe. We aren't burning fossil fuels in our kitchens that cause huge problems for respiratory ailments in the poor countries. So yes, it's a concern, and yes, we should be concerned about inequality, but when it comes to the environment, environmental equality is far greater in wealthy countries that have innovation. Full stop.
Steve, your thoughts on inequality?
I think that one of the things that made the United States, and by the standards of the rest of the world, really unusual, was that at the founding of the country, there was not a sort of a dominant ruling class the way there was in Western Europe or elsewhere in the world for that matter. The United States certainly was unequal in the sense that there was slavery, and it was certainly unequal in the sense that there were some people wealthier than others, but it was unusual in the sense that at least amongst the free white population north of the Chesapeake, land ownership was widespread and literacy was widespread. In fact, the US probably at that time had the most literate population in the world. These were important ingredients to what came next, which was a decentralized democratic, or you could say Republican system, political system, and a market-based system in which people competed intensively against one another. I think for us to move forward as a society, we cannot do so without maintaining those elements of US society that were so important, the positive elements of it that were important at the founding, which is access to literacy, that is education broadly defined, and access to the market for everyone broadly defined. I think one of the big challenges we're going to face is not inequality in the sense, or we are facing, is not inequality in the sense of just the distribution of income, although I think that's important. It's not just equality of opportunity. I think that's important too. It's equality in terms of access to innovation. And one of the things that happened over, I'd say, the last 15 years and has been reversed in the last two, with Makan Delrahim as Deputy Attorney General for Antitrust, has been the use of government to make an more unequal playing field when it comes to the patent system. And so inequality here has many, many dimensions. I think it's important for us to do something about it. And I think it's an open question as to exactly what the right things are to do. But amongst the things that it seems to me cannot be amongst the positive things to do is to simply put, to make decisions in a centralized manner, because what you're likely to get is capture by groups already powerful who are going to create an ecosystem that looks very different from the ecosystem that gave us America's very rapid rise to a high level of material prosperity and a very high level of democratic engagement by the standards of the world.
Terry and Steve, thank you so much for your time, for sharing your thoughts. The next session is the Human Prosperity Project Speaker Series coming up on October 1st. We'll talk to Neil Ferguson and Victor Davis Hanson. And then they'll be talking about the history of socialism and capitalism on October 15th. Perspectives from Germany, China, and Hong Kong with Michael Oslin and Russell Berman. Please visit hoover.org for more resources. Everybody have a great day and a great weekend.